I'm going to be focusing on crisis communication, something that I focus my best practices studies on in my PRL 497 capstone class. So I want to focus on best practices in crisis communications for my project because I believe knowing the history and basics about crisis communications and what steps to take when a crisis hits and learn more examples of organizations that handle crises well will benefit me in any industry or job role I enter. Organizations or individuals will face crises at a time. I'm positive everyone will face a crisis in their professional career at one point or another, and that's why it is important to know how to handle a crisis. There's no single definition of crisis. Some of the definitions included when I searched an emotionally significant event or radical change of a status in a person's life, an unstable or crucial time or state of affairs in which a decisive change is impending, and a situation that has reached a critical phase. When an individual or an organization faces a situation that can be defined as a crisis, that's when public relations professionals step in to help. After the Tylenol crisis in 1980, public relations professionals have become responsible for handling the specialized activities of crisis communications. How you prepare for a crisis, act during a crisis, and respond after a crisis are all responsibilities that fall under crisis communications. Crisis communications is defined as the collection, processing, and dissemination of information required to address a crisis situation. There are studies that prove that how an organization responds to a crisis has a lasting impression on the brand. It is essential for public relations practitioners to understand the best practices in crisis communications because any negative news story, no matter how big or how small, can pose a significant challenge for an organization. Throughout my research, I read about many theories and plans that organizations could put into place that will ensure their organization is not too badly damaged by a crisis situation. Crisis communications, as we know it today, originates from disaster management. In early publications detailing crisis management, there was a strong emphasis on disasters. Today, it's a little different because the source of information and the volume of the information flow is very different than the past. In the past, the mass media played a major role in how crisis information was disseminated. Today, the public gets a majority of their information from the internet. What is different about crisis information on the internet versus traditional news outlets is the widespread accessibility and the collaborative platform the internet provides the public. The shift in retrieval of information from traditional news outlets to social media augments the accuracy and efficiency of the news that is shared. This creates a major issue for organizations because information about their company could be completely wrong or false information. Public relations practitioners must be able to carry out both crisis management and crisis communications. Crisis management is the overarching organizational process carried out, and crisis communication falls underneath crisis management. Crisis management is defined as a set of factors to combat crises and lessen the actual damages inflicted. According to Coombs, somebody who wrote a lot about the topic of crisis management and crisis communications, the actions taken in crisis management can be divided into three categories: pre-crisis, and then crisis, and post-crisis. All of which crisis communications have responsibilities in. Crisis communications does fall under all three.
Crisis communication responsibilities in the pre-crisis phase includes collecting information about potential risks, training the crisis team, and training spokespeople. During the crisis phase, which is when a crisis is happening, collecting and processing information is a crisis communication responsibility, as well as distributing that information to the correct and important audiences. In the post-crisis phase, the crisis communications responsibilities include analyzing the crisis management efforts, communicating changes that are being made post-crisis, and crafting a follow-up response if necessary.
In my research, I read about many theories in crisis communications that can guide practitioners on how to act in a crisis situation. I'm going to explain two of them that I thought were particularly interesting and important in the study of crisis communications. The first is a widely accepted theory by Timothy Coombs, somebody I mentioned earlier, who does a lot of research and studies in the area of crisis communication. This is called the situational crisis communication theory. This is based around Bernard Wiener's attribution theory, which states that people search for the cause of an event. particularly events that are bad or unexpected or cause a lot of commotion. People want to find the source of that. So that's a crisis situation for most organizations. So in this theory, the amount of attribution your company has to the actual crisis is how you should respond. So there are 3 clusters or levels of attribution depending on the crisis situation. So if there's completely no attribution and your company or organization had nothing to do with the crisis, then you can deny that you had anything to do with it. If there's a little bit of attribution, there's some connection between your organization and the crisis, which is usually accidental. You didn't mean to cause the crisis, but it just happened. Then you could try to diminish the situation. The third level is when there is a strong attribution of responsibility between the organization and the crisis. So if you knew you were intentionally acting in an inappropriate way that caused the crisis, then you need to respond in a way to rebuild your reputation. So the next theory is the social mediated crisis communication model. And I thought this was particularly interesting because it was developed for the changing media landscape, which is something that we're about to enter in the workforce. Currently, the public considers the internet the most reliable source of news, and the social mediated model focuses on the way to combat crises that live online. The social mediated model is based on the idea that organizations must understand where the crisis information came from to better understand how to respond. If you understand where the information is coming from, then you are better equipped to combat the crisis. So I'm going to go through the 3 publics where a crisis can come from. In the social mediated model, there are 3 publics that produce and consume information. One is the influential social media creators. The second public are the social media followers who consume the influential social media creators' information. And the third are the social media inactives who consume the information offline through word of mouth or traditional media. So based on where the crisis originated, either in one of those 3 publics, public relation practitioners are able to craft a response. Another way to carry out crisis communications is to wait and see before responding. This is called the wait and see method. The Streisand effect occurs when individuals or companies lawyer up to censor something that most people would have never seen or known about in the first place, and ends up drawing attention to an issue that probably wouldn't have been ignored otherwise. The wait and see method doesn't mean ignoring the problem. It suggests that not every situation needs every crisis communication responsibility to be carried out immediately. You can carry out the wait and see method if you're unsure if the crisis affects your organization or your audience. In the wait and see method, you do a deeper analysis of the problem before responding and deciding if it's absolutely necessary to respond. And for large and serious crises, the wait and see method will not work. It will negatively affect your organization. When the link between an organization and a crisis is weak, or the crisis situation has not gained much negative media attention, the wait and see method can be carried out to ensure that the Streisand effect does not occur. So after a robust literature review, I'm able to identify a few best practices in crisis communication. Number 1, be prepared. It's important that as part of crisis communications, you know where potential crises can come from before they even happen. Number 2, timing. It's important to respond within a timely manner, and an example of this is PepsiCo and United. The 2 large organizations both have faced large crises this year. What separates them is timing. Within a day of airing an unfavorable ad, Pepsi pulled it and issued a statement taking responsibility and apologizing. It took United several weeks to issue a statement after aggressively removing a passenger from an airplane. Research showed that the number of people willing to fly with United dropped over 20%, from 68% to 42%. Pepsi, who took immediate action, lost only 1% of people willing to buy Pepsi products. Pre-crisis, 56% of consumers were willing to buy Pepsi products, and now only 55 are. So that's 1%. Number 3 in best practice is analyze. It's important to analyze a situation and know all the correct information before making rash decisions. Because if you do this, you're making sure you're not sending out false information. Number 4, target the correct audience. It is important your response gets to the right people. If your response gets to people who never even heard about the crisis or don't care, then what's the point? And then number 5 is how you respond. It is important that you create an appropriate response that acknowledges the crisis and provides valuable and factual information that will answer the public's questions. So you don't have anybody coming and saying, well, what about this and what about this? You responded to everything that people could question. So after doing a long literature review and doing much research on the area of crisis communications, I looked at 3 case studies. I'm going to go through 2 of them that I thought were particularly interesting. One was Domino's. When on Easter Sunday, when 2 employees were bored, they stuck cheese up their nose, took a video of it, and took a video of them putting it on a sandwich. Domino's wasn't even aware of this situation until a consumer affairs blog posted it on their website the same day. And Domino's carried out many of these best practices. They analyzed the situation first. So they went through their computer system and made sure that the sandwiches were not actually being served to people. They were making sure that there were no orders at the time, which there weren't because it was Easter Sunday and most people aren't ordering Domino's on Easter Sunday. They continued to have open communication with the consumers at Flarebogs, which is targeting the correct audience, because they knew that that's where the crisis originated, which is something that we went over in the social mediated crisis response model. They also responded to the correct target audience in the correct way. Basically, they knew that the crisis lived on YouTube, lived on the internet, so they created a YouTube response of their president acknowledging and explaining that they went through the computer system and it was all a hoax. So I thought that was a really, really great example. The second example is when the Cincinnati Zoo had to unfortunately kill Harambe, their gorilla. A 3-year-old boy fell into the gorilla pen, and Harambe, despite the zookeepers trying to distract him and calm him down, was pulling the boy through water and being very physical with him. Unfortunately, they had to shoot the gorilla and kill the gorilla to save the boy. Immediately, all over the internet, people were mad because they thought that they could have maybe tranquilized the gorilla or maybe done a different way of trying to get the gorilla away from the boy instead of just killing the gorilla. And within days, so timely response, they issued a statement online, a written out statement about the situation. They targeted their audience, the people who had questions and were posting online, by posting this online, and they addressed the main issue that the gorilla was so big that a tranquilizer wouldn't affect the gorilla. A tranquilizer would take 5 minutes to tranquilize the gorilla, and the boy was in imminent danger. So if it was over the gorilla or the boy, they had to save the boy. And they also addressed that they were very upset about this and that the gorilla is part of their family and they are grieving the loss of Harambe. And this was an appropriate response because it made them look like they were a humane organization that do care about their animals. So I thought that the Cincinnati Zoo did a wonderful response in answering all the questions, providing factual information, and being sincere and making people understand the situation from their point of view. So those are the case studies I looked at, and I very much enjoyed looking at crisis communications for best practices paper this semester, and I do think that it will be beneficial in any job, any industry, any organization I will be in, and I will be able to provide information on crisis communications to my colleagues and to my organization.